Elliot.
I'm basically with Henry, except I can name one of Taylor Swift's songs. Uh, and I've heard more Benny Goodman in my life than I have Taylor Swift. But the bottom line is that this is vintage Trump. He comes out of nowhere and does strange things. And he probably is trying to. Again, it was a slow news week, and she's so popular. Why not? And
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, I'd like to welcome back our panel on the New Frontiers. Elliot, Pollock, thanks for being with us today.
thanks for having me.
Professor Thompson, happy to have you with the show here today as well.
Thank you, Paul. Great to be here.
All right, and Governor Ducey, we're always happy that you're here with us. We're gonna, I think, have a fun program today. We're going to be talking about immigration and some other issues, and I love having your input.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
So today what we're going to talk about, we're going to spend some time talking about immigration in detail. But before we do that, I want to hit on some of the hot topics that seem to be in the news today. I find them to be interesting. The first one was what we saw in front of Congress yesterday. Yesterday, there were several social marketing companies that were put in front of Congress. Behind them was a group of people who many of them had lost family members due to what they saw as being bullying online and other issues. Mark Zuckerberg was kind of forced to turn around and address the audience and apologize to them. What was interesting is that there were Democrats and Republicans really berating these folks. And one of the things that I find to be interesting, I remember a long time ago I read this story about two kids who were literally the kids that were on the honor roll. They were top performers. They were planning on going to an Ivy League school. And they ended up being in a position where they had messed up in their schooling. They had messed up on their grades. They were so worried about losing their placement in school that they decided not to tell their parents, and they took off with the third little boy. Now, the point was they got this so far out of perspective. The other boy ended up robbing a store. They ended up fleeing. By the time they were done, they all committed suicide. This was long before we had issues of social marketing. But what was the same back then was that children take things out of perspective. They don't have the same long-term perspective that we have. And the internet has really blown that up. Now, what I'm struggling with is this concept of how far should government go into fixing this problem? Is it more of a problem that we have to have our own individual responsibility in trying to fix? I'm looking to try to get Amy Klobuchar. We've extended her an invitation to talk about her bill on New Frontiers. Or is this something that government needs to regulate? I'd love to have everybody's input. Governor, I'll start with you.
Everyone knows where I stand on freedom and free enterprise and choice. I always start with the individual and believe our rights come from God and not the government. And I'll hold our Constitution, Declaration, and founding documents dear. With that being said, something is wrong with social media and these technologies. You know, we don't let kids go and buy beer. They have to be of a certain age. We don't let them drive until age 16. Much of the convenience and magic and beauty of the internet and the conveniences that it has provided is because government has stayed out of the way. So I don't know that government is always the solution. I think you'll recall in Arizona, we had some arcane laws around brewers and distribution. And Four Peaks was only allowed to sell so much beer. And after they got to a certain platform, they went from being a restaurant to being an actual manufacturer. And I got all the folks together and I said, you guys want to come up with a solution that you can pitch to the legislature. If you let the legislature write the solution, they're going to legislate you right out of business. And I saw those 4 or 5 leaders sitting in front of Congress, all well scripted, all with their message points, but they really were not providing any solution to the heartbroken moms and dads that were sitting behind them. So I think that there are changes that are necessary. I'm not an attorney or a legislator. I am a parent. We monitored our kids and watched all of this closely, but you can't stay ahead of it. The kids are smarter than the parents are. So I think there's an opportunity for us to do better. I see a lot of talk from business leaders, and this is rare for Congress. I see a real desire for action from Congress. It concerns me when Congress wants to act when they're not better informed on good solutions. And to me, that's what the opportunity is here, is to convene smart people that have a stake in this and also embrace freedom, but to figure out how we protect our young people. It's not only affecting their mental health and all the issues that you touched on, Paul. I also think it's affecting their education. These phones, I believe, do not belong in schools. They should be checked in the locker when you go to school. If a parent has an issue, they should have an emergency number that they can call. You can check your phone after school, but kids do not pay attention with all these notifications. They don't read deeply. They don't have a attention span in which they can focus on analyzing numbers. I think we need to address this.
It sort of strikes me as a little bit similar to the issue with smoking in a way, right? That this is something young people, we might want to restrict their access to social media somewhat until they reach a certain age when they're better able to deal with sort of social implications, the potential for bullying and things that are on these social media platforms, maybe until they're 16 or 18 or something like that. I am really going to be interested to see how this plays itself out, for the reason that the resources that these social media companies have are so immense, right? One of the things about these social media technologies, they tend towards monopoly, right? So there are sort of natural economic reasons why there tends to be clustering and on just one platform or a few platforms, or as we've seen with Facebook and Meta, they're putting the platforms together so they control a vast majority of people's engagement with the social media. And the advertising revenue, because of the monopoly position, is just tremendous for these companies, whether it's Meta or Google, or even Twitter, which is a little bit smaller, I guess, than Meta for sure. The advertising revenue is so huge that these social media companies are going to be able to exert a lot of pressure on elected officials. They're going to have huge lobbying resources in Congress. And so I'm going to be really interested to see, especially as we know that some of these social media companies have been really involved in managing information flows around elections, really worried about what they call misinformation and disinformation. I'm going to be really interested to watch and see how this plays itself out, because the resources available to these social media companies to try and influence the regulatory or the legislating process are just so tremendous.
Yeah, I think both Henry and the governor hit it on the nail on the head. These companies are going to have to do something, or it ultimately will come out of the political process, which will clearly be a mess. I don't have a clue as to what the answer is. I agree that kids should not have phones in school, but that's just part of the problem. The problem is, how do you prevent, I hate to sound like 1984, but like the mind control that these things, the effect they have on kids. I don't know what the answer is, but if these companies, no matter how wealthy they become, annoy enough of the public, it's going to come out of Congress, and that will be a mess. So I was hoping that these companies would get together and come up with a solution that would deal with these. They didn't, and I think that they're playing with fire.
Okay, so along this line, I'm going to pivot here to talking about Argentina and Javier Milei. Javier is, I admit to this, he's a little bit of a hero of mine. I love his form of economics that he's talking about. But what's interesting to me about Javier is that, when I've been to Argentina several times, and one of the last times I was there, I recall that literally my friend told me to bring a bunch of American cash when I came in. He said, it'll help you out while you're here. So I brought American cash. Well, literally, we rented our hotel. We rented the hotel in the currency of Argentina. And then on the day that we went to pay for it, he took me down to the street. We took our cash and we traded it in. The inflation rate was so bad that literally by the time we traded in our cash a week later, we ended up getting our hotel room for 25% of what it had cost when we had originally booked it in American dollars transferred to the Argentina currency. The point is, Argentina is a mess. Now, Javier spoke to Davos the other day, and I really encourage anyone to listen to his speech. We'll put up a couple of slides here on this particular item. But Javier, the point that he made that to me was so profound is that if you have any question about socialism working, if you have any question about the impacts of budget overrides and not living within some type of constraints, look at his country, look at Argentina. It is maybe one of the best speeches. I'm not sure that it was well received at Davos, but I thought it was one of the best speeches that I've seen given there. Elliot, I know you spent a lot of time on this. You looked at the speech as well. Can you give me any input that you have?
Well, again, it's amazing to me somebody like that got elected in Argentina. He essentially is a libertarian, and in a country that where socialism has worked its magic and destroyed the country. And I'll just say, in general, there's a lot of people claim that capitalism is nothing but self-interest and people aren't safe in it. Well, socialism is nothing but political self-interest, and they use the political system to screw the public. I'm not sure I can point out any socialist country that has done well in the long run economically. I hope this guy is successful. I think it's going to be difficult because of the cronyism that already exists. But at least it's a great sign that the public has figured that out.
I think Malay is a symptom of a country in desperation and grasping for desperate solutions. And it just so happens that the kind of neoliberal program that was implemented in a lot of countries in the 80s, Britain under Thatcher, to a certain extent, not quite as extreme, but to a certain extent, the United States under Reagan, certainly my country, New Zealand, in the 1980s, went through a massive neoliberal program that ended up being very similar to a lot of what Malay is proposing. It just so happens that when countries reach a dead end in terms of economic policy and they have hyperinflation, they have sclerotic growth, it just so happens that the neoliberal program is there, right? It's like a kind of an off-the-shelf program of deregulation, cutting government spending, cutting taxes that governments can always turn to if they want. And what I'm fascinated, like Elliot, is that a country like Argentina that has this long tradition of left-wing politics, Peronism, massive state intervention in the economy, that they've taken this kind of desperate turn. I think that it's going to be interesting to see whether Malay is successful. I think you might be able to hear my dog in the background there. Sorry about that, Paul. It's going to be interesting to see whether Malay is successful in the long run, because it's exactly these types of neoliberal reforms that have been so critiqued by the left for so many years. And in Latin America, critiquing neoliberalism and this deregulation sort of program was the bread and butter of socialists, and has been the bread and butter of socialists since the 80s and maybe even before. So if Malay's program is successful, then it could rejuvenate the economy. It could be really good for Argentina. But if it's not successful, and if it's not successful relatively fast, then of course the leftists will take this as evidence that neoliberalism is always bad. It always leads to inequality. It never solves society's problems and all these things. So I do think there's the danger of kind of a backlash against Malay's neoliberal policies if indeed they don't generate growth soon, I would say, and reductions in unemployment, and especially if you can't get inflation under control.
And the question is how long that takes. Governor, any thoughts on Malay?
It's an excellent speech. I highly recommend it. I hope we put it in the show notes. I posted it, Paul, on my Twitter feed. There was a good AI translation from Argentinian to to English. And so I applaud him for one of the better speeches in modern history to differentiate free market capitalism versus big government socialism, and to do it in a very compact, concise, convicted way. And it not only did I want to share it and send it to my family thread and out on all my social media posts, it certainly defends Citizens for Free Enterprise and the good work we're doing here, the magic and exceptionalism of America. I did some research on Argentina because I know it hasn't always been lost like it is right now in socialism, and it was among the most elite countries in the world in the 1930s and 40s from a prosperity standpoint, and it went from that type of quality of life and access to material goods and services to what you experienced on vacation, probably eating great beef and drinking fine wine and getting a 75% discount on your hotel room because they can't manage the economy from a monetary or fiscal standpoint. So a lot of props for Malay. I hope he's as good a leader and manager and administrator as he is an economist.
Me and you both. All right, so here's the next question. Next question is, there was no primary that is happening around the nation, at least this week. But of course, Trump, not wanting to be outdone, decided that he would go after Taylor Swift. Now, here's what I find to be interesting about this, and this is my question to you all. I've heard the conspiracy theory that effectively she's some part of the deep state, and that there's that she and her boyfriend are planning to get the Kansas City Chiefs to win through some type of fix, and then she's going to announce her big support for Joe Biden. I also had a friend of mine, one of my granddaughters, called me up and asked me if Taylor Swift was satanic. Well, I asked her where she had heard that, because I don't even know Taylor Swift, to be honest with you. I don't think I could tell you the name of one of her songs. So I don't want to age myself, but it's just really not my generation. In any event, I said, well, where'd you hear that? And she told me. And it ended up being a son of a friend of mine. So I call him up and I said, okay, so I got to know, tell me what's going on with this. And he starts telling me about how Taylor Swift is satanic and everything else. I said, all right, I got to know this. Do you really believe this? Is this something that you really believe? Tell me the truth. And he finally said, look, I think Joe Biden's evil. And because I think Joe Biden's evil, he said, when we find out that there's somebody that's going to come out for him, we need to band together to make certain that we go after them. Now, it concerns me on one hand that that's a strategy of people Taylor Swift seems to be the one that was wearing the chastity ring and seems to be religious on the right wing in many different ways. But putting all of that aside, here's my question. Is this a crazy political strategy, or am I missing something in this? Because I don't get this at all. It seems like a huge diversion. It seems like it makes no sense to do it, but maybe I'm missing something. So Professor Thompson, let me start with you on this one today.
I'd like to say that I'm just as clueless about Taylor Swift as you, although I probably could recognize a few of her songs. But I don't know why Trump is engaging with this whole narrative. Taylor Swift is one of the most influential cultural personalities in the United States, probably one of the few people that kind of has his level of name recognition and sort of fame. Maybe that's why he feels he has to preempt her coming out to support Joe Biden. But I personally am a little mystified by this kind of intercultural debate. It's way out of my competence, and I don't really understand how this is cropped up as a kind of you call it a kind of conspiracy theory, etc. I find it all quite perplexing personally.
I'm basically with Henry, except I can name one of Taylor Swift's songs. I've heard more Benny Goodman in my life than I have Taylor Swift. But the bottom line is that this is vintage Trump. He comes out of nowhere and does strange things. And he probably is trying to, again, it was a slow news week, and she's so popular, why not? and his main body of support probably agrees with him. I don't know enough about it to say anything other than you think he'd have better things to do. All deference to former President Trump.
I don't get it. And just when you think the conspiracy theories can't get any more crazy, we hit a new low. I love playoff football. I am rooting against the Chiefs. I've had enough of the Chiefs, but it doesn't have to do with Taylor Swift. We all know Brock Purdy is a local product, and I'm rooting for the man that was the last person drafted in the NFL. I think it's a great success story. But I do want to say I actually went to Apple Music to play like the top 3 songs to see if I recognized them. I wouldn't have known they were Taylor Swift, but it was my niece, Kate, who's a young lady. She's a Swiftie, and she loves Taylor Swift with the same kind of passion that I loved Michael Jordan when he was playing, or I think the country loved Muhammad Ali. And I think in many ways, this is a throwback story. I mean, this is the jock with the pretty blonde, and it's got all kinds of people that could care less about the NFL viewing and watching. And this is probably the only broadcast that brings America together again. We all grew up and we watched the last episode of MASH and the last episode of Cheers and Seinfeld. But now people watch the AFC and NFC championship, and everybody watches the Super Bowl. So I think there's actually kind of a feel-good story here, and I'll feel even better when San Francisco hoists the Super Bowl trophy and Travis Kelce can console himself with Taylor Swift.
Okay, well, I like Travis Kelce, but nonetheless. So let's go to the last conspiracy theory possibility that exists, and that's about Elon Musk and Neuralink. I don't know if any of you have been following, but he just ended up he says that his company just ended up inserting the very first device that would give the ability to create a link between the human brain and an electronic device. Now, I know that he's looking to utilize that for a variety of things, especially quadriplegic patients. By the way, a little plug for Barrows in Arizona. They're actually engaged with him. But I guess the question that I'd like to ask, certainly give any input that you would like on Neuralink, but one of the questions that I think the public seems to be debating is Elon Musk a cause for good or not? Governor, I'll start with you on that question.
I think Elon Musk is a cause for good. And before he started to share some of his partisan leanings and love of free speech, he was lauded by the left. And everyone that was center left was beating the drum for electric cars and that Elon was going to save the planet. I think what this guy has done with his space exploration company, with Tesla, with the satellites is remarkable. I mean, it's what has allowed Ukraine to defend itself to date. I don't know enough about Neuralink except what I've read lately. Shout out to Barrows. You're right, that procedure did happen at Barrows, and it happened with great confidentiality. From what I understand, I think that the Neuralink was inserted in a paraplegic or quadriplegic with some hope for healing or therapy or recovery. And I don't know how Elon Musk has the capacity to operate in all these different arenas and operate as CEO. So I see him as a force for good. I think it's patently unfair that a judge in Delaware can take away a public company's right to compensate its largest shareholder and founder. So I think there's going to be a backlash on this. But I think that Elon, while he's a human being and we are all flawed, he's doing a lot of good and bringing a lot of innovation and excitement to a number of different fronts that can improve the future.
Elon Musk is not a once-in-generational genius. He's a multi-generational genius. I don't know of anybody since Edison, who's been able to do so many things in such a short period of time. And it is just the way capital markets are. He's making a lot more money, even adjusted for inflation, than Edison ever did. But this guy's just a plain, simple genius. There's no two ways about it. And how you politicize somebody like that with that type of genius and the things he's done is just, it's appalling. It's just appalling. And if he's able to do what he wants to do with what he's doing now, it will change the lives of so many people we can't even count them. And B, I agree with the governor that how much money he's paid by a private entity, a private sector entity, is none of the judge's business, just none of his business. I will tell you that my perspective after being an expert witness for a long time and seeing the legal system is, I'll just ask you the question. What do you call a lawyer with an IQ of 60? Well, the answer is Your Honor. And I really believe that
I got a couple of court cases, so I don't agree with that.
But I honestly think that to politicize Elon Musk is a mistake. And I challenge the people who don't like him to tell me when's the last time somebody has done things that affected this many people in a positive way. It's been a long time.
Yeah, Elliot, Musk is a political guy. I mean, he weighs in on political matters all the time. I think the politicization of his salary or whatever is maybe a little irrelevant given it's a private company, but he's a very political guy. He has his political preferences, and it seems to me like he likes to also have things both ways, right? He likes to be seen as this entrepreneurial genius who is riding the free market, and there are large aspects of that that are true, but at the same time, his company Tesla has got to be one of the biggest recipients of federal subsidies in the country at the moment, given the whatever it is, 3,500 that every single EV gets. They price their cars to make sure that they get the subsidy. It's unclear whether that company would have been able to do what they've done with the electric cars if it wasn't for massive subsidies, encouragements for electric cars. So I agree that he's an amazing entrepreneur. He seems to be especially effective in manufacturing, especially very high-tech manufacturing, doing things that other people can't do. But I think that he is a very political guy, and he sort of plays this very complex game where he tries to appear as all things to all people. I feel the same way about Twitter, right? He says it's this free speech thing, but at the same time, we know that social media, and I think Twitter's probably the same, are having negative effects on mental health. And a lot of people think that it's a really negative place to be online. So I think he's a divisive figure by nature, and I think he courts that. And that's also just sort of there in his business activities.
Yeah, I just point out that that the oil barons basically became oil barons because of the tax laws that were passed to depletion allowances, so on and so forth. So that's nothing new. And I think that I doubt he had much to do with, I think it would probably the larger auto manufacturers that basically wanted to have that the tax incentives for electric vehicles, although I'm sure that Musk didn't complain about it, but I doubt that he's the cause of that. And I would absolutely agree with you that I have heartburn with those tax incentives, but they are what they are. Virtually any new thing is getting those tax incentives and has in America for years and years, for decades, for centuries. The fact that he has political opinions should, I don't think, change people's view of what this man has accomplished. You know, he can say things that I totally disagree with, but he's still done amazing things for the human race. And by the way, Twitter, I don't even count that because it's going to be a mess, as we talked about earlier. But in terms of what he's done to advance electric vehicles, in terms of what he's done with the race into space, in terms, I just think he's a phenomenal guy. I don't have to listen to his politics. I don't really care any more than I think a great actor who gets up there at the Emmys and makes a bunch of comments that I consider inane doesn't change my view of them as an actor. It changes my view of, them as a human maybe, but not as what they do well. So I might not like Elon Musk as a person, but boy, has he done a lot for the human race.
All of I've been able to meet some of these folks. They're involved in states and economic development. They're all political actors. They all have political opinions. Elon Musk has had the courage of his conviction to express political opinions that are unpopular. He was a heck of a lot more popular when he was living in San Francisco and keeping his mouth shut. When he relocated to Texas and has been outspoken on what's happening on the left and the censorship, he became much less popular because he flew right in the face of the mainstream media and the left-wing establishment. And Elon Musk is a businessman, and I don't like crony capitalism, but it's not his fault that the Democratic Party prioritized electrification of vehicles and offered these subsidies. These subsidies were available to the greatest car companies in the history of the world, to Ford and GM and Chrysler and Toyota and Hyundai, et cetera. And it was Elon Musk who found a way to put a product out there that people not only bought, but that they think is far superior to anyone else. I mean, business people are going to do what business people do, and they're going to find the best deal. Elon is more than a business person. He is an innovator. He is a scientist, and he's an entrepreneur. We have gotten caught up in what he says, and he doesn't mind that. He goes out and pays a heavy price for that. But to see the unfairness of, as Elliot said, these judges making decisions, to have an electric vehicle event at the White House and to not invite Elon Musk, to me, that smacks of real politics, destructive politics. Elon's allowed to have unpopular opinions, but I give him a lot of credit for getting in the public square, making the case, and paying the price.
It's not lost on me that Elon Musk seemed to be kind of liberal when he was selling electric vehicle cars. And the minute he moved to trucks, he started becoming more conservative. He might be smarter than we actually think, even from a marketing standpoint. But nonetheless, I agree with both you, Governor, and Elliot. This guy's been a force for good. It doesn't matter to me what his politics is. Thank God he's part of our generation. He's done some amazing things that I think are good for us. Now, let's go to immigration. If you look at what's happening in the immigration debate, I mean, you don't have to watch television much to know that immigration is just dominating our headlines today. One of the interesting issues was what happened in Texas. There's a little island that ended up being created. I think it's because the Rio Grande water avulsed, and it created this area that was in dispute between the United States and Mexico as to whether or not that land that was in the middle where the river moved to and from was Mexican soil or American soil. We've claimed it as being ours. But nonetheless, the cartels were using it. They were using it to get information on immigrants coming in and out so that they could keep their product moving. Well, the governor of Texas got the Texas Rangers to actually go out and to clear them out. And they put some barbed wire out in the water itself, which I guess the federal immigration force didn't like because they couldn't then deal with people who were coming across and they worried about drowning. The Biden administration ended up filing a lawsuit against them. I think it's an ill-advised lawsuit, but nonetheless, that's the reason that it's such a big issue in Texas. What you'll see on this particular map that's by U.S. Facts is that Texas has about half of the immigrants or half of the immigrant issue coming into their state. You can also see that it's a fairly big issue in Arizona. Arizona is one of the darker colored areas, and that's also obvious by our headlines. In this particular slide, you can see that our Democratic governor, who succeeded the governor who's on this show, has actually said that that she's wanting to deal with the border crisis. In this particular slide, I think one of the things that's clear, to be fair, when you're looking at it, is the immigration problem has grown dramatically under the Biden administration. I just don't think that you can avoid saying that that's true. Now, I do think that there's an issue between the amount of people that are apprehended at the border and those people who are getting through. And by the way, when you start trying to look up the actual factual number of how many people are getting through, it's very difficult to ascertain, at least it has been for me. But nonetheless, the reason there are more people on the border, it seems like, even though there are some big issues that are going on around the world where people are looking to get out of their country, part of this is probably driven by the idea that we had a president that seemed more open, and so more people end up going to the border. What you can see in this is that there has been an improvement in terms of those people who aren't getting through the border. So in that past slide, to be fair, there are a lot less people getting through today on a percentage basis. Again, I don't know what the real number is in terms of actual numbers, but there's less people getting through on a percentage basis. However, it's off of a much higher base number. Now, this issue has become obviously very controversial. And before I go to the next slide, Governor, you spent a lot of time on this issue. By the way, I want to give you a compliment. I think you did a great job of not only dealing with this issue, but not being hyperbolic, not tearing apart our relationship with Mexico and other people in the process, but still putting a focus on it. Can you give us what your thoughts might be on what we're seeing today in the news?
Certainly, Paul. I'm very passionate about this issue, and I also have a pet peeve. I would like people to rewind the tape to the beginning of this segment and to substitute the word border security every time you mentioned immigration. This is not immigration. This is border security. Immigration happens in the nation's capital. That's where it is reformed. That's where the laws are written. Border security is a national defense issue. There are bad people, terrorists, that are coming across the border. It's also a public safety issue. People are dying of fentanyl. The cartels are in charge of border policy, and it's also a public health issue. We know that diseases can be transported and can be man-made. We've just experienced this, and our southern border is wide open and unprotected, and this is Joe Biden's fault. He reversed every executive order that the Trump-Pence administration put into place. The border is never perfect, but it was secure and stable in 2020. And Joe Biden, just because he can't stand Donald Trump, willy-nilly removed each one of those executive orders. And what we have right now is what you can see with your own eyes. If we would think of this in three buckets, first is border security, and that is a solvable issue. Next is immigration. And we have an immigration system. It is failing. It is in need of reform. And I have a lot of ideas around that. But I don't want to talk about that until we get the border secure. And last is trade relations. My first visit internationally as governor was to Mexico City. My first international visit upon re-election was to Mexico City. My last official act in international travel was to Mexico City. They're Arizona's #1 trading partner. They're our largest customer, and every governor in the country has a #1 or 2 trade relationship with Mexico. I'm thrilled that so many people are going to visit Jerusalem. I did as well. I think every governor should go and visit Mexico City and Canada. These are our trading partners. They can make for a peaceful and prosperous North American free trade. But this is a border security issue, and the president can act unilaterally here, and he should do that. And this should be stopped. Americans are dying and overdosing of fentanyl. You hear the stories in our high schools and college campuses. These kids are actually not overdosing. They're being poisoned. They don't intentionally take this fentanyl. They're doing something else that they deem recreational. I think it's wrong and reckless, but they end up dying from it.
So on this next slide, there is a bill now in front of Congress. Joe Biden is saying that if that bill's passed, he will effectively use it to shut down the border. And by the way, I agree. The problem has grown over his period of time, and I think he holds responsibility for that. That bill probably wouldn't have come about without Republican pressure, without pressure from the other side. But the Democratic Party, I heard somebody say yesterday, we're late to the party, but we're here. And then the question becomes, where are they? Well, the question now is whether or not Republicans will support that bill. By the way, I think it's fair to say, and I heard this a lot from a number of different Republicans yesterday, which is they don't really know what is in the bill yet. And to me, that's a fair thing. You ought to have a right to know what's in the bill before you end up committing to it. But one of the things that seems to be going on is that Trump is looking to try to sabotage the existing system. Now, I'm just going to give my input on this as a political strategy. I think if the problem gets solved or doesn't get solved, Trump actually ends up getting credit. I don't know why he needs to try to undermine the bill itself. I think actually undermining it is a bad political strategy. The idea that he was to this issue first, I think people will end up giving him credit for either way. But purely as a matter of politics, do you think that that's a good strategy or not? I'll start with Professor Thompson, then I'll come back to the governor.
I think for a nationalist like Donald Trump, having immigration at the top of people's minds going into the election season is the optimal thing for him. He started his 2016 campaign, his most notorious claim, and he went to the Texas border to do this, was to build the wall. I think a lot of people kind of didn't believe that this could ever be done, and then he did actually make quite significant attempts, expended significant political capital to try and secure the southern border in a way that had never really been attempted up to that point. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Trump, whether you're talking about Nigel Farage and the Brexiteers in Britain, or the Marine Le Pen in France, or any of these new nationalists around the world, immigration is their absolute core issue for mobilizing voters. And I also think it's one of the issues where they get the greatest reach into more moderate supporters. So I think for Trump, whether this bill goes through or not, having this at the front of people's minds is the absolute best thing for him this year.
The politics are terrible on both sides. First and foremost, Joe Biden doesn't need Congress or the Republicans to put these executive orders in place that he removed. Remain in Mexico, Title 42, asylum in the first safe haven country that people come into, etc. I put those out on my Twitter feed when I was governor. They're readily available from the RGA. Also, the Republicans should be both Senate and House. If they are going to put a bill in front of the president, it should include a border wall. And that should be step one. We've got sections of the border where there is a physical barrier. Physical barriers work, but when there's a hole in the physical barrier, the cartels take full advantage of it. And where you see the break of masses of humanity coming through, those are the cartels stewarding vulnerable people who have been human trafficked with their life savings to get 1 foot over the border. It's a distraction. Border security and law enforcement is overwhelmed, and then the cartels just ease their way through with fentanyl and other drugs with no concern at all of being caught. So if we have a true bill that's a real reform with a wall across our southern border, that is something that should be promoted and moved forward. But Joe Biden can act this afternoon by putting these executive orders in place. Every time, both sides play each side against the other on this. Anytime the word comprehensive is involved, we know that there's never a solution. And that's why I separated out what the only discussion now should be border security. Once that's done, you're going to have every small business owner in America beating the drum for immigration reform because they need workers right now. So this is solvable, but neither side is demonstrating leadership.
All right, so we've all spent a significant amount of time talking about the difference between immigration and what is happening with border security, as the governor says. And Governor, I think that is an excellent way to look at it. One of the things it seems to me that's being missed is that we're really not intentional about our border strategy. In fact, if you were to ask me what is the right amount of number that should come across the border, I don't know that. Not only do I think I don't know, but I don't know that we're really discussing that as a country. What this slide shows is that roughly a third of all U.S. immigrants have a college degree. Now, I think that's important because look at the other countries and how much better they're doing, especially Canada and in Australia. They're up in the 60 percentiles of people that actually are coming across with a college degree. Now, what you see here is that Canada adopted, I believe it was in 1967 or 1968, a point-based immigration system plan. And from that day, they've dramatically improved how many people actually are coming across that are that end up having a college education. What this slide points out is that an overwhelming majority of people believe that we should have more immigrants if they're either a higher skilled workforce or if they're college educated. You can see here with the United States, almost 78% of the public support more immigrants if they fit into a highly skilled immigration individual. Now go to the next slide, because I think this one is really interesting, which is of people who actually oppose immigration. When you talk to them and you say, how do you feel about the existing immigration system? And they have a very negative view of how badly we're doing. Even amongst them, 63% of them feel that if we're getting a higher skilled workforce or better college educated people, that it's worthwhile for us to be able to allow that to happen. This slide just shows you that those numbers end up holding true across all demographic areas. In terms of age groups, it just doesn't matter. There is a large support for actually increasing immigration of high-skilled workers or of college diplomas. You know, we're one of the great places in the world that are educating some of the best minds anywhere. And then when we get done with them, we tell them to go back home. The slide after this, I won't spend much time on it, but this just talks about how actually we end up benefiting economically from immigrants. And again, I'm going to create a separation between border security that the governor is talking about and actually inward immigration. In a moment, I'm going to ask Elliot about this, but certainly we know that if more people are paying into the Social Security system and less people are taking out, there's a benefit to it. And if more of those people are higher educated and higher paid and younger people, that's helpful as well. This last slide actually has been in the United States Congress. This particular slide came out of the Bay Area News Group, but this slide is about a point system that the United States government's been talking about. I think it's worthwhile to look at it. By the way, I should say this. A merit-based system was first proposed, or at least the first time I saw it proposed, it was proposed by Donald Trump, and it just went nowhere. I do believe it went nowhere because it was Donald Trump proposing it. I think that the divisions are so high that sometimes, even if he had a good idea, the other side wasn't willing to spend any time looking at it. But what this does is it gives you a good idea of what a tiered system might look like. And so what they've done is they've created maximum amount of points. You would give 30 points for someone who had U.S. work experience and job in the high skill field. You'd give 10 points to a high demand job. If they were an entrepreneur, you might give them 10 points. Civic involvement, you'd get 2 points. English, if they speak English, if they have a family that's here, if they have an age, there were points that were allocated to that. The country of origin that mattered, and then the overall education level. The idea here is, whether that's the right point system or not, I'm sure that we can debate it. It is an intentional strategy around immigration. Now, if you compare us to Canada, if we were doing the same amount of immigrants as Canada or Australia, instead of having about 1 million immigrants a year, and I'm talking about now legal immigrants, we'd be somewhere near 3 million. But today, the immigrants that we're getting are dramatically lower, both in skill sets as well as in advanced degrees. So I'm going to go back to the panel, and I'm just going to ask you to, start with this idea. Does it make sense for us to have a merit-based system? And should we be actively looking at maybe even trying to recruit people who are in those higher income or higher degree type areas? Governor?
How Elliot framed it is how I think we should promote it. You said what's the right number of people coming across the border? Well, ideally, it's zero. This is an illegal act. This is not immigration. Like I said, these people, vulnerable and ill intent, are committing an illegal act. So I think our immigration system should be categorized with two thoughts. I don't like merit in this setting because for a number of reasons. It should be needs based. What do we need? What does the American economy need? You know, Steve Jobs was the son of a legal immigrant. The founder of Google was a legal immigrant. But we also have tradesmen, you know, welders, plumbers, electricians. These are not people that will have a college degree. They'll either have a skill or they'll have gone to trade school. I think first and foremost, they should want to be Americans and they should want to learn and love our country. But what does the economy need and what does different regions of the country need? I think that would be a good measurement. And along with that, a values based immigration system. We do have the Statue of Liberty, and we have been a safe haven for people that are being politically oppressed, not just people that look for a better economic opportunity. If that was the only standard, we'd have the entire world coming to the United States, and we can't provide for that. So I think we need to look at both of those categories once we secure the border. And it should be both needs-based and then values-based because, folks, you can go on YouTube right now and learn how to legally game the asylum process. That's wrong. That's not what it was intended for. And there has to be a stop put to that.
You know, Governor, I think that is an exceptional point on values. You know, my opinion is, you know, it doesn't matter to me what religion you are. Obviously, I believe you should have the right to come here. Whether you're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, it just doesn't matter. On the other hand, you know, if a woman decides in a family that she wants to be subordinate to a male, that's definitely her business. She wants to be a homemaker, that's definitely her business. But if she doesn't want to be, she should have that right not to be subordinate. She should have that right to be in the workplace. And if you don't buy into that value or values like that, this is the wrong place for you. You should go somewhere else, right? Our values value every individual. We believe in human rights, equal rights, but we also believe in things like property rights. Our economy came from those basic set of rights that we believed in early on. And again, if you don't buy into them, this may just not be the right place for you. Now, Henry, you came from Australia. I don't know how the hell we recruited you over here, but we got one of the bright minds into not only into the country, but into Arizona. There are controversies around the Australian system. I'd love to know what your input is on that.
Paul, how many times am I going to have to tell you I'm from New Zealand, not Australia? I'm just totally aghast once
Damn
again.
it.
It's okay.
What's the difference, Henry?
I won't get up in arms about it. Yeah, but New Zealand and Australia have essentially identical immigration systems, very similar to the points-based system that you described there. There are various controversies around it. In Australia, the main controversy is very similar to what's going on in the United States at the moment, which is that Australia has struggled to control the ocean arrivals from places like, especially from Indonesia, right? And so illegal arrivals in Australia were being transported to offshore islands for processing, and that because the conditions there were relatively inhumane, and oftentimes there was no path for them to enter Australia, and people could stay in these places for years in limbo, that generated a lot of controversy. But that's the main controversy in Australia. In New Zealand, the main controversy around the points-based immigration system is about the unintended secondary effects of immigration. So the points-based system in New Zealand has been used to, the immigration is controlled. Obviously, New Zealand and Australia are islands. We don't have the same problem, apart from this particular issue in Australia towards Indonesia, of uncontrolled entries as much. But the kind of maximum limit on how many migrants come in has been a real aspect of controversy for the flow-on effects, and particularly on real estate. Elliot, you probably find this interesting and maybe not that surprising, that real estate in New Zealand and Australia is kind of like Vancouver or San Francisco. There are huge constraints on building, both because of, you know, a lot of the cities are kind of in harbors where there's not a lot of space, but also there's tremendous amounts of regulation on building new housing. So in New Zealand and Australia, both and I think you could say the same about the UK, is that they've used immigration as a way to boost economic growth, at least headline GDP figures, but those have driven real estate prices through the roof. So a lot of working class New Zealanders resent immigrants and immigration. And I think the same is true in Australia, not only because they compete with immigrants for jobs, but because they feel that the immigrants, especially the high income immigrants, right, that can afford the real estate, are pricing them out of the real estate market. So it's almost like the points-based system and having a controlled entry and exit to the country has defused a lot of the incendiary political nature of immigration in Australia and New Zealand and probably in the UK. But there are knock-on effects that have been quite toxic, I would say, and really damaging to the political economy of Australia and New Zealand from controlled but nonetheless extremely high rates of immigration. I mean, I think that the rates of immigration in New Zealand and Australia are still higher than the United States, even though you have an uncontrolled border in the United States per capita. The immigration flows into New Zealand and Australia, and that's had huge effects on affordability for people in the cities, particularly.
My reason for being such a big supporter of a merit-based system, or maybe that's semantics. I think need-based is the same thing. Need-based, merit-based, and values all being included is because I look at what's happened in the past. Had we not have been able to have attracted scientists like Einstein, this country may have been in trouble, both in terms of our wars as well as in terms of our overall economy. There's a lot that can be given to the United States in technology through intellectual brain power, and we ought to be doing the best that we can to attract it. Now, that takes me, fellas, to this next thing that we're going to be doing here, which is this whole concept of what happens in the environment. Is the economy and the environment diametrically opposed to one another? I always like recommending books on this show, and I can tell you that all four of these books, I know that Elliot and I are both inside a similar book club, but all of these books are very, very good books in terms of how these two things actually integrate. Steven Pinker, who wrote Enlightenment Now, Harvard professor, he gives a great understanding of how we really are in one of the best advanced periods of time in the Enlightenment. The Rational Optimist is a book that I recommend to everyone. It's about why you should be optimistic, and it's based upon the growth that we've seen that have come from capitalism and trade, and then Why Nations Fail. Why Nations Fail, I think, is an exceptional book. The thing that I'm the most concerned about going on today in our politics is what I call the politics of pessimism. There is this huge divide that's happening in the public, and everybody thinks it's between the right and the left. I see it a little differently. I see it between the people who are pessimistic and the people who believe that there is an optimistic view of the future. Pessimism has a real effect on public policy. People who believe that the world is falling apart and that everything that is happening is existential and the other side is causing major grief end up not only having a pessimistic point of view, but it has an effect on the policies that are done to try to appease them. Optimism gives you a completely different view. Harvard professor Steven Pinker said that there is a new concept of environmentalism, which is grounded in Enlightenment optimism rather than romantic declinism. Now, he calls that approach eco-modernism. So let's talk about these terms for a moment, because I think that they're really amazing terms. For those of you who don't maybe know what the Enlightenment is, the Enlightenment is a concept that really came about in the 17th and 18th century, and it was focused on the ideals of rationalism, science, the concepts of both optimism, as well as a belief in individualism, the power of the individual and what they could do. It really culminated with the creation of the United States government, which was founded on the concepts that came from the Enlightenment themselves. The concepts of the Enlightenment created a massive set of economic progress, and the United States government, as well as capitalism, did the same thing. Well, anytime you have a large amount of progress that's taking place over a short period of time, that begins to create some tension because people have this sense or this feeling that things are changing quickly. That creates what's called the romantic declinism. The romantic part is believing somehow or another that things in the past used to be better. And declinism is based upon the idea that everything is getting worse in the future. You can see it throughout history in so many different areas. I like this Childe Harold's Pilgrimage because it's a painting that was done literally about the 17th or 18th century, I believe. But you'll notice, you have these beautiful hills, the beautiful lights. You'll see the monk down at the water's edge. What they're doing is they're saying, hey, our past used to be so much better. Now, here's what's funny about this picture. They're painting a picture of what we now call the Dark Ages. It was one of the worst periods for mankind on the planet. But they romanticized it. They romanticized it because the changes that were coming from the Enlightenment scared them. You can also see it in our artwork. The Lord of the Flies, which was, by the way, one of the greatest books I ever read. And I like the part about the Lord of the Flies. It's talking about when society falls apart and there are no rules and structure, what happens. But it was also a sense of fear that was coming from all the changes that were happening in society as we began to become more democratic, as there were more people participating. Brave New World, the same thing. Brave New World is this movie about how technology is going to destroy us and how it's going to begin to control every aspect of our life. Now, I'm worried about AI technology, but not so much that I would try to slow it down. In fact, what we know is that there are authoritarian governments that are already trying to utilize AI technology to create security to clamp down on the individual. We should be utilizing AI technology to figure out how to expand the rights of the individuals, how to empower them even more than they're empowered now, and utilizing that new manpower to think about how can we keep their privacy secure. Now, romantic declinism has also been used over and over again for social movements. In this particular slide, you see the young rural boy who is kicking a Jewish man. The Jewish man represents urban change to them. And they talked about with the creation of the Volk, how return to these rural roots was what made them stronger. But really what was happening in fascism? They were talking about this romantic past that they had that never really existed, that never really was there. And then they found a scapegoat to blame the decline that they believed that was happening inside of their existing society. We also saw it with romantic declinism in communism. In communism, who did they blame? They blamed rich people. They blamed the capitalists. They blamed the people that were making money. And the idea was that must be the group that's causing the decline to happen in society. From almost the beginning of the environmental movement, well, good things have come from it, but almost from the beginning, there was this idea that we weren't going to be able to handle all the problems that were being thrown at us because of the changes that were happening in our society. Ehrlich wrote this book called The Population Bomb. And when he wrote this book, he said that we were never, ever going to be able to grow the way that we had been growing because literally we were going to run out of food, that we didn't have enough food, enough land to be able to feed most of the people on the planet. Now, at the time, we had about 3.5 billion people. Shouldn't be lost on most of you. We have about 8 billion people today. What happened? Well, I can tell you, we found better ways to grow our food. We found ways to grow food with less land, with less water, that was more nutritious. He was wrong. The startling book that he wrote called The Population Bomb said that we were going to lose billions of people. That's romantic declinism. He was giving us this talk about how the world was declining and how we ought to go back to something better that used to exist. Now, romantic declinism almost always hits capitalism. They see capitalism as the reason for their problems, and that it's industry and capitalism that causes the challenges that exist in the environment. So what happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall is we began to gain a glimpse of what had happened in a society where capitalism didn't exist. Through dialectic materialism, we had this whole concept of that if you could freeze the economy in place and distribute the wealth in a more fair way, that you could end up improving all aspects of mankind. Well, of course, as we look behind that wall, here's what we found. It didn't get better. All throughout Europe, it got a lot worse. Certainly in Berlin, we saw that. In East Germany, if you you get a chance to read through this slide, read through it. But it literally created, there was so much smoke coming out of the tops of the stacks of the plants that were built there that it created an acid rain that destroyed what was considered once the beautiful forests of East Germany. Now, why did that happen? Well, that's simple. Without economic progress, they were frozen in place, and they couldn't afford to pay for the scrubbers on tops of the smokestacks. And without the scrubbers, it just simply bellowed out pollution. That wasn't just in East Germany. In Romania, they said the children from the Upper Silesia area of Poland had been found to have 5 times more lead in their blood than the children of Western European cities, while half the region's children suffered from pollution-related illnesses. And just so you don't think that this was just simply the satellites, because it does make sense. What happens with authoritarian governments when their economies begin to decline, the only way they can make up for it is to steal the resources from other places. So those resources from Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia and others, they were filtered back into the Soviet Union. But even in the Soviet Union, the same thing existed. If you read this particular slide, they said that 40% of the Soviet people who lived in areas where air pollutants were 3 to 4 times the maximum allowable levels. Sanitation was primitive. Where it existed in places like Moscow, it just didn't work properly. And half of the industrial wastewater in the capital city went untreated. In Leningrad, nearly half the children had intestinal disorders caused from drinking water. It's also not a problem that it was limited to the Soviet Union. If you go to Russia, this is the Serbia Lake of Garbage. I mean, this is a beautiful, pristine area of Russia today. But it literally, the lake is filled with garbage. Capitalism isn't the problem for the environment. In fact, it may be the only savior of the environment. Yet, we hear people who, talk about all the problems of capitalism. We hear about things like eco-terrorism, the battle for our planet. And I love this one, no GMOs. Without GMOs, we would have starved 1 billion people off of the planet. And there's no scientific evidence that GMOs are bad. But nonetheless, there's this fear, this romantic declinism that tends to make people think that any type of progress is bad. Saying no to nuclear power. Look, I'm one of those who actually believes carbon is a problem. I don't believe it. I know it. There's no doubt in my mind that carbon is adding to a global climate change, probably a global warming, and there's no doubt that that's caused by mankind. I think denying that is wrong. But the question becomes, how do you fix it? I have seen 0 proposals that actually show us how to fix it without nuclear power becoming one of the areas that we utilize. Now, this next slide is important just to think about the following and to think about whether or not constraining the economy actually helps. So if you go to China today, literally 1/3 of the entire society works in agriculture. 1/3 of their workers work in agriculture. And yet, they're the largest importer of food in the world. On the other hand, in the United States, less than 1% of our population works in food production, and we're the largest exporter. Here's the point. The point is efficiencies don't create more pollution. They create less pollution. They feed more people. They give us more money to pay for the scrubbers on tops of the smokestacks or the water treatment plants or the alternative energy sources that we need. There is a connection that exists between capitalism and saving the environment. And anything that we do should be trying to promote both goals at the same time. We shouldn't just simply promote how it is that we reduce carbon if we know that we're going to create poverty in the process, if we know that we're going to cause damage to the economy. Because if you damage the economy, you're going to have less resources to pay for those things that you see as being important. Here's the bottom line. These things are symbiotic. The idea that we have people in large cities, that's a good thing. The fact that we have them in dense areas where we can deal with their needs is a good thing, and it can be compatible with the environment. There is a symbiotic mutualism that exists between capitalism and the environment if we really want to try to fix our problems. And as long as we're utilizing scare tactics and trying to terrify people or terrorize them about what's going wrong and not being willing to look at reason and rationality and science, we have no chance of being able to fix this problem. And more importantly, the power of the individual. If we give up on the power of the individual, the ability to own what you create, to innovate, to be able to come up with new products, then we really are in trouble, because 8 billion people on a planet without technology would be an environmental disaster. So I'm going to turn back to my panel to let them give us some comments.
So the theme of what you're presenting, I like. I guess I'm not comfortable with the term eco-modernism. It just to me sounds like a pointy-headed coastal elite academic type idea. To me, this is what I would call free enterprise, and that America very rarely, if ever, solves a problem. It traditionally innovates out of that problem. And the issues that we have with the climate and emissions and what I would call pollution and the desire and need for clean air and clean water can be solved in this type of environment which you describe. And I think we should embrace it and find ways to get government and bureaucrats and administrators out of the way so that it can happen. And that I'm a big fan of.
What I would say is that if you don't have a strong economy, you simply don't have the resources to deal with these problems. And I think that history tells us that capitalist economies are actually way better on environmental protection than socialist economies, right? You just have to compare, for example, look at West Germany and East Germany in the 1980s. One of the major reasons why the East German socialist regime collapsed is because they were polluting their rivers, they were polluting their air terribly with really old-fashioned heavy industry, chemicals, coal, steel, all that stuff, whereas the West Germans that had been doing that in the 60s and 70s probably for sure, by the 80s they had moved on to much more high-tech industries that were much cleaner. And so not to mention the fact that in West Germany they had a democratic system of government that allowed people to complain and allowed them to have some responsiveness in the government and improving the environmental situation. So I think history has shown us that actually there isn't a trade-off between capitalist development and environmentalism at all, actually. In fact, the two have gone hand in hand if you look at history in the big picture. So I'm pretty skeptical of these claims that you have to trade one off against the other.
Okay, I know I took longer on that last section than maybe I should have, but I think today's discussion was a great discussion, because not only on the environment and capitalism, on immigration, but because I definitely think that these problems that we have, they're real problems. What I've always loved about politics, it's the place we go to solve problems. But to solve problems, people need to be able to not only have a discussion, but to say the things that they believe to be true. We appreciate you being part of New Frontiers. We really do think that there's a great frontier in front of us, and we can't tell you how much we appreciate you being here. If you like what it is that we're doing, push that subscribe button.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.